everyone. Welcome back. I am so happy to be reconnecting with an old friend and collaborator who I've worked with before, Michelle Hawk. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to continue the conversation.
So good to have you back. Yeah, I was on your podcast a few years ago. Getting into some controversy. I love it. It's my favorite. So hopefully we'll revisit it here in this conversation.
Hmm.
But if you don't know Michelle, I'll tell you a little bit about her. Michelle Hawk began practicing shamanism in 2003. Her core lineages come from Hungarian and Celtic shamanism. A naturally gifted psychic and intuitive channel, Michelle's work with alchemy, shamanic energies, and multiple certifications as a master healer allow her to offer the deepest level of transformational work. She mentors and trains practitioners in ethical shamanism, alchemy, and the healing arts, and helps people master their intuitive gifts and magical birthright. She's also a host of the Shaman Sister Sessions podcast. Michelle, it was interesting before this. I said, "Oh, I always ask, what's the path you were on, or what you used to do?" And you said, "I didn't used to do anything. It was always this." I'm curious, in that case, let's hear about, growing up. Did you know at a very young age that you were a healer, that you were intuitive, and how did you actually come onto this path of shamanism and this kind of healing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was one of those magical alien children, as I think all children are to a certain extent. And fortunately, I grew up in an environment where my parents never told me that's bad or wrong. They just said, okay, that's nice. Or, well, what else is the dog saying? As I would be translating what the animals were saying or what the plants were saying around me, which, as we know, I was probably tuning in intuitively and connecting with the nature spirits. So when I was I think the first like quote healing spells I was doing when I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and it just made sense to me because I was seeking out stories and reading material and using my imagination around magic and around animism. And so looking at what, having the frame of reference that I do now, looking back at what I was really drawn to as a child was animistic practice and magical philosophy. So I was seeking out stories and mythology, like indigenous, Turtle Island indigenous people mythology, but then also global mythology of, the fairy people and the animal spirits and the nature spirits and communing with magic. So that was always very attractive to me as a child. And then in 2003, I was 15 or 16 years old, and I met some people who owned a clinic that they did Reiki at, and they said, "Oh, we're having this shamanic journey workshop. You're invited to come." So I went to a shamanic journey workshop at, 15 years old, and it was like they were giving me a language to describe everything I already knew to be true. So I did this shamanic journey workshop and it was so easy for me and it was really effortless and it made sense and it was almost like they for every one thing they told me, I remembered 10 more things. And it was the context and the vocabulary for the worldview that I already had. So I dove in and I kept studying, I kept practicing. I took many workshops with many different teachers. I eventually met the teacher that I have been working with on and off since 2009, who is she's my core teacher, and that lineage comes from Hungary. And then my other core lineage is from Celtic shamanism, but I've had many teachers over the years, many Turtle Island indigenous teachers from different nations. And as we know, shamanism has kind of this pop culture association as being unique to Native Americans, and we know it's not. We know it is ubiquitous to all of humanity as an earth-based spiritual practice that, and while many traditions might be similar or the same. Obviously, there are different flavors and nuances for different cultural expressions and interpretations of that. So we have kind of a weird relationship with it here in the US. So I feel like part of what I'm doing as a shamanic practitioner, as a shaman of been studying and practicing for 20 years now, and having been initiated in a core lineage and working with a mentor for 14 years, part of what I feel like I'm doing is I'm re-educating and reframing people's relationship to shamanic practice, especially now as we are coming into this, I don't know if it would be the second psychedelic renaissance, right? But this like whole return of psychedelic practice to more of a forefront of common culture, or like popular awareness, and then bringing shamanic practice into that, and kind of rewriting a lot of what people think it is, and helping people relate to it in an ethical and integrous way, because there's so much of shamanic practice that we see in the world that is not in integrity and that is extractive and appropriative and causes a lot of harm. It's very exciting.
Wow. Yeah, no, this is it's exciting to be alive at this time and to be able to dive into this. Because I want to ask you some practical questions about, having this as a business and being a healer. But I would also love to know, just because I'm my own curiosity, I'm curious, how is your lineage of Hungarian centered shamanism different than, say, what maybe I would know working with shamanism that's based in, let's say, like South American lineage, or, like a different kind of shamanic practitioner that has done like a soul retrieval with me or whatever. Like,
Right.
how are they different?
Yeah. So let's remember that shamanism is contextual, like inherently, and shamanism is relational. So, as an earth based spiritual practice, it is all of the unique manifestations that we see between all of the different cultures are really dependent upon the ecology. Like shamanism is spiritual ecology, because we have to remember that unlike other spiritual traditions, so let's imagine, for example, like working with galactic energies, or working with like hermetic mysticism, like that is, I would call more like upper chakra work, where it's like, it's geographically independent. You can do it from anywhere and it doesn't really make a difference. And it's, you're working with these spirit entities, like upper world spirit entities. But shamanism is inherently working with the body and with the earth and with the elements and the animals and the nature spirits and the land, like necessarily as a function of an earth based spiritual practice. So the cosmology of, for example, like a, South American lineage, where we see very commonly calling upon the condor, or calling upon the particular mountains or the particular plants local to that area, it would be completely different in another part of the world, where they're working with, say, for example, like the reindeer people, like the Sami people, right, where there is also a very strong shamanic tradition. Yet for them, they have completely different nature spirit cosmology that they're orienting toward and drawing from. So we must remember that shamanism is contextual. And that's part of where I see, again, going back into like ethical shamanic practice and what it means to be in integrity in our practice. Part of that is knowing that some practices are similar or the same across the board. Like you mentioned, soul retrieval, that is, I would consider a sort of a pan-culturally present shamanic practice that I have seen in many different lineages, or working with, for example, like fire spirits, right? Like, fire is a very strong element across cultures in shamanic practice. And yet working with the local plants, like ayahuasca, for example, is really unique to tribes in the Amazon. And whereas if you go to, again, to use the Sami as an example, right, like they're working with Amanita muscaria, right, and in the reindeer urine. And so they have different medicines, and even like non-psychoactive medicines, right? So cacao is another example of a really strong plant medicine, or all of these different medicinal relationships that they have with the nature spirits are completely localized. So again, there's going to be a lot of crossover in terms of like working with the directions is really common cross-culturally, working with a below and above worlds, working with soul retrieval, working with the ancestors, working with different manifestations of deities, like if you're near the ocean, you probably have an ocean deity that you're working with, or water deities. If you're working with the mountains, you have mountain deities or stone nation or stand, with the trees, with the standing nation people, right? And so there are these very like similar parallels across the board, but the uniqueness comes from the context, and that is irreplaceable. So then we look at, okay, if you're going to study with or to practice with a tribe in the Amazon, for example, some of those practices absolutely will translate when you come back home to the US or wherever you happen to be, and some of them won't because you'll be in a completely different context.
Thank you for clearing that up. And I love it. I'm shaking my head because, excuse me, I'm blessed enough to work with, mostly like what one would call indigenous, which by the way, the people that I work with are actually mestizo, which is not, it's a mix. But the let's say North American facilitators who I have sat with have always brought in the context of where we're sitting, meaning like, okay, this isn't just a medicine ceremony with ayahuasca. We're actually bringing in a lot of the Native American practices, the medicine songs, the certain ways of holding the ceremony, because that is native to the land I'm sitting on. So I think it isn't actually really important to bring this up, and I love this that you're distinguishing this and sharing it with everyone. So I want to get into more of the actual shamanic work you do, but before we get into that, I always love to know, you were doing this from 2003 onward, 20 years. And I'm sure, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was, you're on the West Coast. Maybe it was a little more accepted and welcome. But, a lot of people struggle with this idea of like, well, how can I actually make a living as a healer or as a shamanic healer or, doing this work that maybe the mainstream doesn't really accept yet, or it's getting there now. But, 10, 15 years ago, maybe it wasn't, right? How did you grow your business and how did you make this, actually support you? Yeah. And I'm curious, what are some ups and downs and any stories about how it's been?
Oh yeah, there's been plenty of that. It's been quite an adventure. So when I started my practice, also remember I was a teenager. So I was still in high school while I was beginning my shamanic studies, and then I went to university. And at that time, I was also investigating and training in energy healing practices, working on channeling and mediumship. So I was in the science department getting my degree in biology alongside all of these pre-med people who were very like type A, go to med school. And here I was suggesting maybe meditation and consciousness practice has a role to play in modern medicine. And all of my classmates, I remember just like the feeling of rejection over and over of like, oh my gosh, you're crazy. Like there's no way. And, and my degree in animal physiology and behavior, I was looking at doing some research on, I think the first project I suggested was around like the effect of meditation or consciousness practice on the growth of plants. And which, seems like a very easy to measure thing. Like in my mind, that's like, oh, a very straightforward practice. And yet that was rejected as being unquantifiable at the time. And so then I ended up doing, I know, right? I look at that, I'm like, it's very quantifiable.
I'm shocked.
And, but then I went and I did my research in Costa Rica and hummingbird foraging behavior. And that was super fun. And it was, it was more like, quote, sciencey appropriate at the time. And I didn't have to push really hard to have this emerging body of knowledge that made total sense to me be accepted at the level of academia that that I don't know if it was ready for it. And I think there were certainly people in certain departments that were much more attuned to that. So I was taking some courses in the psych department on alternative health and medicine. And oh my gosh, I loved that class. And the professor, really had a big impact on me. I actually emailed her not all that long ago, like a couple of years ago, and say, hey, here's what I'm doing now. And she invited me to teach a lecture in her class, and then COVID happened, so it didn't happen. But but it's been an interesting throughout my entire life, especially in the early years, being in high school and being in university and being really shunned for these practices that I was speaking about and trying to bring into the conversation. And so when I started my business, I actually started it while I was still in university because people kept wanting to pay me for my work. And at the time, I was working exclusively with animals. I was doing animal communication work, and I was doing energy healing work with animals, and also doing some shamanic journey practice, but not. I wasn't advertising any of this. People just found me because I would do sessions for a few people, and then they would tell everyone, and then they would contact me and say, "Will you please do me a session? I would love to pay you." So I started my business as sort of a like, okay, fine, like, sure, I will take your money to do this thing. And then I went and lived in Spain for a while, and people kept reaching out to me over Skype. Will you please do this session with me over Skype? And will you please work on my dog, or my horse is sick, or I'm wondering if my cat needs help with end of life. Will you please help me? And so I did. And then I came back to the US and people kept asking. And so I was like, all right, I guess what happens if I put some attention on this? And what happens if I lean into this? And so I pursued that, and I started teaching Reiki, and I started expanding my work with humans as well, because enough people were saying, well, you're doing this healing work with my dog. Can you do a healing session for me? So I honestly, every single thing that I was resistant to was what people were asking me for. I was like, oh, fine, I'll work with people. And then, but I don't want to teach. Ugh, fine, enough people are asking me to teach them, so I'll do that. Ugh, fine, I'll teach shamanism. Like I wasn't actually interested in doing any of this for other people at first. It just kept being asked of me over and over and over and over. So that is how I got into doing this as my business, is people just kept asking and asking and asking until finally I realized that all of these resistance points that I had were exactly where I was being called and invited to deepen and to commit and to serve. So eventually I don't remember exactly when that surrender really happened. I just decided, okay, I'm in. You keep asking me, and obviously the invitation is here, and people keep pulling this out of me, so I will let it go, and I will say yes to this, and it will be the thing.
These are my favorite stories. It's a lot like mine too, where it was like, what?
Yeah.
Is this even a thing? People pay for this? And really just saying yes to that call, which, I mean, I'm sure you would agree at some point that it's this soul's path that sometimes, we're in our own way. I said no to multiple things until it was kind of like, oh, maybe
Yeah.
this just keeps coming to me because of something else that I don't even see.
Yep.
And I really now I'm sure you as well. I'm always on this path of like, I don't know what's next. I mean, who knows? It's because the pull never ends. I don't believe that we're just like stop and that's it. There's no more expansion.
Yeah.
So I love hearing these kind of stories because there's so many people listening that I know feel that, and then the logical ego mind gets in the way, that's like, but how do I make money, or how am I going to survive, or
Mm-hmm.
how is this even possible? But that's
There's
why there's support out there, including people like us.
Exactly. And I mean, honestly,
So
like
let's
there's a little bit of
yeah.
that too, and that's always going to be there. But I think that that's the part that
Yeah.
one of the biggest learning curves that I have had is to really lean into and embrace the uncertainty, because this work exists beyond me. This work has a life force and a life path and purpose all its own, and I am here as a student and a steward of this work. And so just recently, I mean, you were asking me about the ups and downs in this practice and about that trust. The most recent growth edge is that my work asked me kind of at the end of last year, beginning of this year, to take a break from my alchemy course that I developed. That's my year-long intensive apprenticeship training program that I love, that is very thorough, and I have all the materials worked out for, and I've run it several times, and I have multiple apprentices graduated from this course. Like it's set and it's good. So from the like quote typical business perspective, it actually doesn't make any sense for me to step away from this. But the calling is so strong of shamanism needs to be front and center for right now. So you need to take a break from I Am Alchemy. It needs a rest, and it'll be there whenever you're ready. I know it's there. It's ready for whenever I am supposed to come back to it. But right now, shamanic practice is asking so strongly, and I'm like getting hot as I'm talking about this. It's like burning me up that it needs to be front and center for the purpose of where we are at collectively in our emergent consciousness right now, and in returning to earth-based practices and ethical practices based in animistic consciousness front and center. So that is
Mhm.
what, and yeah, I have chills right now. So you know it's good when you're like sweating and shaking and it's like this is the thing that is being asked of me. And how could I say no when it's that clear? Of course I say yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I am so glad you brought this up. So many of my clients are going through this right now, and including me, and it's like I've always, thank God, just been so attuned to those messages. Sometimes they take a while to answer or like, what? But then it's like the more they happen, the more you can just say, oh, okay, there's something else coming through. There's something else that is being asked. And if you're really truly on this path of being in service, you put aside the ego that's uncertain, because really what is certain these days? I mean, what was ever certain? There's nothing that's certain. And yeah, I have a lot of clients going through this where it's, I mean, quite literally, in the last couple of years, like therapists that are like, I am not even called to do therapy anymore. It's like something bigger,
Mhm.
something more of service. So this is a natural part of entrepreneurship. And I just want to point it out. It's so important to listen because, as you say, it's always something bigger that wants to be birthed for the greater good of all, including ourselves. So let's talk about this ethical shamanism. I don't think I've heard anybody mention that before. And I'm curious, what does this mean? I mean, obviously, I definitely know about unethical things that have happened in not just the shamanic healing realm, the psychedelic realm, but honestly, all aspects of healing and coaching and honestly, like all of humanity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questionable ethics, and I think there's a lot of sides to it as well, is like this idea that, okay, well, all humans have shadows, let's get that straight like from day one, and then how do we talk about ethics? But I'm
Mhm.
curious, is that what ethical shamanism is, and what is this message you have around it? I'm curious.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, this is huge territory, and we're barely going to scratch the surface a
Yeah.
little bit here. Secondly, I know it's like, oh my God, how long can we talk about this? In You referenced the podcast that I have that you were on, and actually we do have a few episodes related to some of the pieces that you were talking about abuse and narcissism and manipulation and cults in the spiritual community. So if people are curious in hearing more about that aspect of it, they can go check those out. That's Shaman Sister Sessions is my podcast, and there's a few of those episodes. So we do have, when we're talking about ethical shamanism, yes, of course, there's a scale, right? And on one end of the scale, that these episodes that I referenced are talking about was, it's like people, scamming money out of their clients and manipulating or taking sexual advances or sexual harm caused, psychological harm caused, initiating, there's a lot of territories there, like initiating people into really psychically harmful lineages that have all sorts of, and this is just like energetic sloppiness where they have entity attachments or energetic implants, psychic attacks. Again, there's huge territory on the spectrum of how people can be out of integrity in their practice, right? And again, some of it comes from deliberate intention to cause harm, some of it comes from maliciousness, some of it comes from just being sloppy. So there is that kind of end of the spectrum. When I'm talking about ethical shamanism, obviously we're talking about like, well, don't have sex with your clients and don't scam money out of your clients. Like all of that is very, I know that's very common sense, but there is also the
You
aspect
would
of
think.
one would think, one would hope, and we do also we just released an episode on how to recover from practitioner abuse, because actually, as a result of one of the previous episodes that we recorded, I had so many people reaching out to me saying, "I've been in a situation like what you described. Will you please help me?" I was like, "Oh my God." I'm so glad that we put this out, and also I'm just horrified that this is a thing. So then we recorded a follow-up of how to recover from practitioner abuse. So if you have been in that situation, you speaking to all of you listening right now, or if you know anyone who has, then we do have some resources specifically about that. But when I'm referring to ethical shamanism, a lot of what I'm talking about is like, let's be real. The vast majority of practitioners are not out to cause harm. They're not out to take advantage of people. That, it's a few bad apples who are, tainting the waters, right? But most people, if they're out of integrity in their practice, it's because they don't know any better. And it's because they don't actually have the foundation for what it means to be ethical and integrous in their shamanic practice. When we started the episode and you asked me just about my shamanic practice, and or we talked about the like what's different, for example, between Hungarian shamanism and Amazonian shamanism, right? I was talking about shamanism is contextual. And a lot of people don't know that that's a thing, right? A lot of people imagine you go to a medicine circle, you go to an ayahuasca circle that is led by a particular group of people that has their own medicine songs, that has their own prayers, that has their own deities. Most of the shamanic traditions that you might participate in as someone who's going to pay to either be a part of a ceremony, and we're talking like, in this case, I'm using specifically the example of medicine work since that's really emergent in our conversation, right? So if you're paying to go to an ayahuasca ceremony, they're not actually explaining anything to you. You go, you show up, you participate, you observe, you might sing along, and then you go home. They're not actually teaching you. And so then it is really inappropriate to be saying, okay, now I've been to a ceremony or I've been to a handful of ceremonies, and so I'm going to do these practices, right? Because either I think that that's the way that it's supposed to be done because that's the only exposure I've had, or because I'm modeling after what these other people are doing. But like people don't even know what they mean, honestly. Like if you, generally speaking, we live in this weird convergence of, and I'm speaking myself as a white person, obviously, if you're on video, who is trained in many different practices of shamanic practice. My primary lineages are European, but I do have a lot of training from Turtle Island indigenous people and non-white practitioners. But I live in the US, and so looking at my context is I am a white person of middle class privilege, upbringing, and education. And the resources that I have access to put me in this unique position of being Western educated, living in, having access to the internet, having access and kind of the cultural conditioning around open source knowledge and being able to find out things and being able to read WikiHow articles on whatever I want. And having this in the West, we have this weird entitlement to knowledge. And if you look at most other cultures, and especially the cultures that we're learning these practices from, is completely different. Like the relationship to tradition and knowledge and secrecy and privacy and non-cognitive explanation is completely different. So you can go to ceremony and really like inherently the irony that we're even talking about shamanic practice on the internet over video is inherently ironic. Like we do have to acknowledge that. Like this is weird and it is out of context, right? Like ideally we would be sitting together out in nature in person, drinking some tea and listening to the birds and feeling the dirt on our feet, right? Like that is how we are meant to engage with these teachings. So if you go to a ceremony, they're not going to explain it to you because that's not the tradition. It's you show up and you shut up and you observe and you learn that way. No one will ever explain it to you. You just learn by being there. And that is how wisdom traditions have been largely passed down through these wisdom keeper lineages. Even in my lineage, like my lineage that it comes from Europe, like it is the same thing of like, they're not actually telling you these things so much as you just show up over and over and over and you observe and you be quiet and you listen and you do it again and again and again. And you learn by this osmotic, intuitive integration rather than the Western model of you sit there and someone explains it to you exactly and you get this step-by-step instructions of here's a checklist on how to run an ayahuasca ceremony and here's the timing, here's the time schedule of when to do this and when to invoke these deities and here's the exact words that you have to say. That does not exist. That's not a thing. And so then for people who don't have that context and that understanding and that the ability to listen, then they go into ceremony and we're applying the Western colonizer, individualist, entitled mindset that all of us are conditioned with. This is a function of the system that we live in, of a system of oppression that is built on these foundations. We're applying that mindset to a completely different context and taking this tradition and filtering it through the modern Western colonizer mindset and then regurgitating it out into that system, the system of oppression that we are conditioned and cultured in, that then says, oh, I've sat X number of ayahuasca ceremonies. That must mean I'm qualified to serve. Absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. Or I've been to X number of shamanic journey workshops. That must mean like I've done it a few times. I can walk someone else through how to journey for their animal guide. That is, there's a lot. And now I'm like getting really hot again for different reasons. I'm like, just irritated by the system that we live in, obviously. And there's this weird permission for that because that is part of the system that we live in. And because the cultural conditioning that we all have is about, if I pay for that knowledge, it belongs to me. Imagine if you go to university, you are paying for a degree and you get a piece of paper with your name on it that says you are qualified to do XYZ. Right? And so then we live in this society that says that's okay. Oh, you go take a class, that means you know how to do it. But then that doesn't work when we apply it to these mystery traditions and these lineage traditions that are rich and nuanced and exist completely outside of the cultural conditioning that we have. That's just a start about ethical
I
shamanism.
am so glad you brought this. Yeah, no, this is totally, and it's so funny. I just asked someone about this on last week's podcast, who has been serving medicine for 25 years and was very much initiated in through the actual calling from the plants, and was told and actually denied it for a while. I mean, this is the path of the people that I sit with. That's the way. It's like, unless you're told by the plants what you're here to do, i.e. pour ayahuasca, like you're not to pour ayahuasca, no matter how many times, it might come through your ego in a ceremony, which is the question I asked. I'm like, why is it that people do mushrooms once and then want to go give it to everybody? And I do, it's funny because I've never actually had that calling myself, but I can see where the Western ego, especially when people have such big experiences, right? Like they go to a shamanic journeying session and they're like, whoa, I had a bear come at me and then I had this instant healing and this flash of energy. I want to share this with so many people. There is that very that desire, but it's kind of like me and you, our stories. It's like, I didn't even know this was a thing until it was pounding on me over and over and over and over and over. And then I finally didn't even say yes. I got curious. I only got curious for years, and you're right. And it's funny because I actually did a Facebook Live about this a few months ago, where I actually gave someone back their money because there was zero integrity when it came to, the medicine space. And not only that, it was like zero experience, zero integrity. And really it was coming from this place of like, well, and she actually said, I'm paying you. Therefore, and I was like, that's actually what, by the way, that was 10 minutes into our first conversation, and I was thrown over the edge. And I'm like, you know what? Here's how it really goes. And I, with love and compassion, kind of gave her a little schooling on it. I'm like, I don't care about your money, because if you have zero respect for this lineage and these plants and this ancestral medicine, whether it's shamanic healing or working with, any kind of psychedelic, doesn't make a difference. It's a whole other realm we're talking about. And you're also here to help people, you're interacting with human energy fields. And it has to become this embodied practice. Like you mentioned, it's we're going through this when we're in the psychedelic world. A lot of these training programs have come up, especially out where you live in Oregon. And it's kind of an interesting thing. There's, not a lot of actual embodied work going on. A lot of it's just like, okay, well, let's teach how you can give someone mushrooms. And it's like, wow, really? Is that something you learn in a 6-month program that's mostly like studying and not experiential and embodied? So we'll see. I
And
keep saying, I'm like, not my way. We'll see.
oh, absolutely. I mean, I have so many reservations about this, but then also looking at like what are the person's energetic qualifications in terms of the ability to regulate and attune to their own system. Because as soon as you're getting into medicine work, right, there's this whole other aspect that how long has like Western psychopharmacology been around? Like 100 something years, right? Versus like the thousands and thousands of
Grand
years
scheme
of
of things.
these yeah, of these wisdom traditions, right? And the ability to again looking at like the Western clinical therapeutic model as individualistic, extractive, cognitive based, like non-somatic. I just learned, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, like before the 70s or 80s, it was considered unnecessary to talk about emotions in psychotherapy. Can you imagine? Right? Like I just learned that the other day. I was like, that's ridiculous. And so
What
up
they talk
until,
about.
I know, seriously, like dreams and psychoanalysis and Oedipal fantasies. I don't know, but like the fact that it was only, what was that, 50 years ago? That 40 or 50 years ago that they started acknowledging, oh, it might actually be necessary to talk about emotions in a psychotherapeutic context. Like we are modern Western culture or like medicine is so behind the times, like so archaic. And then we have these very subtle and nuanced and advanced traditions that focus that are, for them it's very integrated of energetic mastery and regulation and animistic consciousness and looking at, so what you were talking about, Beth, of like, I of participating in medicine ceremonies, and it's like people have such a profound experience that they immediately evangelize it and have this like I have to become a practitioner. And yet if we look at again the context of medicine in a community, in a tribe or in a system or a culture where it's actually kind of normal for people to have these animistic experiences where they feel connected, where ceremony is instead of a like the pathology model that we have in our modern Western context of there is something wrong with me and I have trauma and I'm going to go take this medicine as a silver bullet panacea to fix it, right? Because fix me, fix me, fix me. Instead, we look at in a shamanic devotional ceremonial context, medicine work is a community resourcing event where it is people, it's a normal part where everybody participates or all the people in the community participates and they have this experience for the purpose of creating energy or for the purpose of collective healing or honoring the ancestors or honoring a particular deity on a feast day, for example. And then they all go back to their lives and none of them are like, oh my God, I need to be a shaman. There's like one shaman plus, their apprentices or whatever. And they're the person or the people who are facilitating the event and they have the guides who are supporting and the community is showing up for the purpose of devotion to participate because it is a normal and culturally accepted context that they live in where we as our community are showing up to pray together, to have this experience together, and it's integrated, it's part of the culture. And so I think for to look at, well, why do people feel this, oh my gosh, I had such a meaningful experience, that means I have to be a shaman, I have to be a practitioner, I have to go study for it. And I think it's because we're missing the context. So people finally receive something that they're so hungry for. They receive that connection, they receive that belonging and the feeling of like almost getting out of the center of their own consciousness and letting themselves dissolve into the collective and feeling what it's like to have this animistic worldview where everything is alive and life begets life and life loves you, and feeling how much life loves you and wanting to have access to that in a deeper way and wanting to support other people to have access to that. I get it. I get the appeal. But not everyone who does medicine work needs to serve it. Not everyone who does a shamanic workshop needs to be a shaman. It can just be for you. It can just be for your practice. And then you integrating it and being that every day and supporting other people in your life just through the radiance of your own being and your own connection. We are the medicine for the world. We in our beingness are the medicine. And that can be enough. And I know we've all had these
Yeah.
experiences of being out in the world and having these magical moments, like without any plant medicines at all, just having these magical moments of connection and belonging. Maybe you're like talking with somebody at the gas station or at the grocery store, and they just say the right thing, and you say the thing that feels really right, and you're like smiling at each other, and you see the divinity in each other, and you just feel so uplifted. We've all had those moments. That is the medicine. And when we normalize that, we will feel less of that. It'll we won't be as hungry for it when we get it in ceremony, because then you can receive the plant medicine and say, wow, that's really beautiful, I really love that, I'm so glad that happened and it exists. And also I understand that just because it's a really meaningful and powerful experience for me, it doesn't mean that I need to serve it, because like you said, we wait for the call. I serve mushrooms. I That was another thing that I was really resistant to for a very long time, but they kept asking and asking and asking and asking. So it is through the repeated invitation of this plant medicine. That is the only medicine that I serve currently, and that will be the only medicine that I serve until or if I get an invitation from another medicine. And if I ever stop receiving that permission and invitation from the mushrooms, I will stop serving them. But if it is asked of me after years of hemming and hawing and deliberating, I did finally say yes to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you bring up such a good point. It's funny because I've had this conversation a bunch in the last just in the last few weeks around what is at the deeper what's the deeper layers underneath this desire to want to give back. And like you mentioned, when you're in this medicine space, your worldview shifts for many people, not for everybody, meaning some people already come in there with that worldview, and that's great. But then, maybe you're experiencing this level of connection or this deeper meaning or understanding or the healing that you want to then see for everybody on planet Earth. Like you said, the evangelistic, right? Like, I want to tell everybody, I want to give it to everybody. I need to bring all my friends here. And there is some aspect of that, like, hey, great, like share your stories, share your light, like you said, run into someone at the grocery store and smile. And that is you changing the world. That is you transforming. But I think at the deeper root of what I've seen over the years of what's underneath that desire to then just go give everybody mushrooms is, where is there actually this disconnection in your overall life on a consistent basis that's giving you that feeling of not having meaning, of not having a purpose? I hear this one a lot. It's like, I want to find my purpose. What is the purpose? Especially the last few years. I think a lot of people are questioning, why am I here during this crazy time in history? And I think there is this, especially, just here in the Western in the US, there is this deeper sense of not having meaning in lives. And I think, at the root of what's underneath, like the ego part that wants to then go heal everybody or serve mushrooms or whatever it is, there's actually something beneath that, which is like, well, let's look at this disconnection from yourself, from source and earth, that is maybe the underlying foundational piece that's missing. And I'm curious, you would probably agree with me on some level. And I'm sure you see this in your clients around like people craving meaning and purpose and fulfillment. What do you think is at the root here, and like what's causing this? Like because I believe we're seeing it everywhere on earth right now.
Absolutely. I I feel like inherently the quest for purpose is like an externally motivated question, right? Because it's like if if we're looking at, well, what is my purpose? It's almost like transposing on top of that, it's almost like we're asking, what is my justification, the justification for my life? What is the reason that I deserve to be here? Rather than because when we think about what's the opposite of that, right? The opposite of that is presence. The opposite of that is actually being awake in our own lives and being really alive, like, really deeply alive. And when I say that, I mean like aware and connected and resourced and attuning to the, again, the animistic worldview, where we're celebrating and feeling the resonance of that aliveness in our bodies and in the animals and in the air and in the land and the trees, right? Because when we feel that connection, we don't ask, well, what is my purpose? When we feel that connection and we're actually awake in our own lives, that's when, again, like, we hear, when we're listening closely, we hear the invitations from spirit and from the world. When we have the voices in our mind quiet enough, when we are attuned enough to the subtle fluctuations of energy, we can perceive where is energy asking to flow, and how can I, as a collaborator, understanding, like, let me also contextualize. When I say I'm a shaman, I don't mean that I am doing the healing. I don't mean that I am having any special role other than knowing perhaps a few more things than the person does that I'm talking with, right? But it is, again, a contextual relational practice of collaboration. Right? It's like consent, where we have consent from the spirits and from, like we're talking about with the mushroom spirits or the plant medicines, right? We have consent and invitation from these spirit allies and from all of the spirit allies, from the nature spirits, from the land spirits, from the spirit side mentors, everyone that we are participating with. We have consent and permission. We have context, meaning we have grounded, empowered, healthy, active relationships with the nature spirits and the allies that we are working with and living with on a consistent basis, and the land spirits where we live, and the plants that are living where we live, right? So we have the context and we have collaboration, right? When we have consent and we have the context, the contextual relationship, then we can collaborate. And that, as a practitioner, is what I'm doing, is I'm collaborating with all of these forces, these animistic forces that are external to me, that are consciousness in and of themselves, that have their own purpose, their own way of being. And their purpose, it's not a justification for their being. The purpose, imagine the purpose of a flower is not to justify its beingness there. It is simply to live its life. That is its purpose. And so when we're listening and bringing all of these purposes together, the purpose is just to live. It is just to be. But the only way that we can actually do that is when we are attuned and awake and present and can actually feel our own aliveness and feel the aliveness in all things. And as soon as we start to feel that, that question goes away. Right? Because then it's no longer, what do I need to do externally of myself to justify my being on this planet? Instead, it's, how am I listening to the invitations for collaboration with how aliveness wants to flow through me as a vessel to express itself in the world? How does the one mind of creation want to move through me as one part of this infinite constellation of dance of creation to express itself? How does consciousness seek to know itself through me? And that is purpose, not what is the checklist that I need to fulfill to justify my existence on this planet.
Exactly. It's so funny because I just talked about this yesterday with my clients, where I said, there's so many people desiring this sense of purpose, right? But in the end, and this is my first prescription, is to just slow down. Because I think one of the issues is our society, I mean, again, speaking from a Western US perspective here, is everybody's just so busy. There's so much noise, so much distraction. People are going, and no one has that listening. I mean, honestly, presence is our most scarce commodity, it seems right now, right? Like, you can't even go to a restaurant without seeing people sitting at tables on their phones with each other. It's like, where's the presence? And I always say, look, you just have to slow it down enough to allow it to come through. And I think that's where there's this sense, again, this cultural programming, like the sense of like, I must know, or I must, like go after, which, I've been kind of diving into this notion of like, it's this gigantic scarcity of like, well, we only live in this incarnation once, and not from the larger perspective of our soul.
Yeah.
And really, like, I think when people start living from this soul-based perspective of like, well, there is no scarcity. We have all the eternal time, quote unquote, in the world.
Hmm.
And really it is about that presence and aliveness. And it's so interesting because, and you also mentioned this earlier, there's so many people turning to, let's say, medicines or psychedelics, different kinds of medicine work, looking for that quick fix, that magic bullet that will just tell them. I mean, there's, and no criticism, no judgment. Everybody has their own path, but, you can go now on a $10,000 ayahuasca retreat to find your purpose. It's like, well, the medicine is not going to just give it to you. I mean, if it does, how much of this is our ego and how much of it is truth? And that's, like, again, it still takes that same quieting down and listening. And it's been kind of, I find it amusing and fascinating because I pray that, it's going to be kind of this messy, bumpy ride for people to just, for humanity to get to the path of least resistance, which is just to be, like you said, like being, I actually use that a lot. The rose, like the rose is not blooming, feeling like she's not doing enough, or she's missing a petal. So now she's not good enough. And now she can't go after her dreams because she's smaller than the rest of the roses,
Hmm.
like,
And
and
she
it's so
blooms,
prevalent.
and she blooms at her own pace. And if you try to go in and pry the petals open, you're going to mess it up. You're going to destroy it. So it will naturally unfold, and allow it to unfold, and allow yourself that same generosity and curiosity. Yeah.
So beautiful.
Mm.
I have one more quick kind of like slightly off topic question before we get into your work and where to find you. But this is something that's been kind of coming through me lately, and I've talked to other people about it, about this notion of all of us alive right now. I mean, I think there's a desire to want to help, right? Like people are having their spiritual awakenings. People are, coming into themselves and having these very profound experiences, whether with or without medicines. Maybe it's just through meditation. Maybe it's just, the energies of today. And there's this desire to give back. And I've talked to someone recently where I said, look, like, it's like you are doing it just by being you as a human living on earth at this time. I believe we're all here as channels, for the evolution, for the healing, for the growth into this new consciousness. And I'm curious, from your perspective as a shamanic practitioner and healer, what would you say to this? Like, because I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong, but I can actually feel it coming through me a lot more than ever the last like 5-6 years, where it's like I get a lot of physical, actual energy, energies moving through me, and I don't make any story of it. I'm just like, whatever, like my prayer every day is like, use me as a vessel. I don't really care what it takes. I'm kind of at that point in my life where it's like, whatever you want, I'm just here in service. But, what do you think of this, especially for people who want to help out and want to make a difference?
Hmm. What do I think about how people can give back and allow themselves to serve?
Yeah, or like this notion of just being, like we're all on some level like vessels for healing, or vessels for transformation, or vessels,
Yeah.
for birthing the new earth, or whatever is happening on earth. Like, do you believe that? Is that true, do you think? Or
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think that, there is no one correct way to serve, just because, again, if we look at removing the question of, well, what is my purpose, right? Because, well, when we be, then that sort of presupposes the question of purpose because we're being, right? So then the same question we can look at that through the lens of, well, when we are being, we are serving through our beingness. Because, let's look at what that does is like when we are allowing ourselves to be, like to truly be, to be alive, to be awake in our lives, what we're doing is we are adopting, I'm going to use like impose some technical language upon this mystical concept here for a moment. We are adopting animistic worldview because through our own aliveness, we are connecting to the aliveness in all things. And when we have animistic worldview, we are inherently also adopting the and cultivating the qualities of empathy and compassion. Because, well, if I am alive and all things are alive, then I can feel the aliveness in all things. So I want to support the aliveness in all things because I am connected to that. So by, looking at I think even when when you and I were talking about, well, what are we going to talk about on this episode? I said something about like the words that keep coming up whenever my guides are talking to me are ethical shamanism and animism, right? So animism is really that way of how do we participate? We participate by the aliveness in ourselves and in all things. And then from that, our natural inclination is going to be to support that because we feel it. So from listening, and being really present, and then also allowing like however that happens in your zone of genius. So I had my my final alchemy apprentice, actually. I told you I'm kind of putting that on rest for now, but she was here just last weekend. So whenever this is released, it might have been a few weeks ago at this point, but she was just here, and she is not a practitioner, but she is a many, many year student of spiritual practice. And she did this apprenticeship with me, and she's been working with me for a long time. And we talked about that because she said, I used to judge myself for not wanting to do this or not feeling the call to do this as a practitioner. And she currently works in academia. She works in criminal justice, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, I want you to keep doing what you're doing, no matter what the manifestation of that is. But within your zone of genius, you don't have to be a practitioner in order to serve. We need people who are not spiritual practitioners, who are not healers, who are not shamans, to do that in the world in their zone of genius, in environmentalism, in law, in politics, in education, in I don't know, city infrastructure and architecture. Like when we have all of this consciousness of animism and life supporting life and life giving life to life, when we have that present in all of the myriad manifestations that is possible, then that's where we can actually grow a new system that is not foundationed in oppression, but instead foundationed in life and foundationed in integrity and respect and mutual collaboration and interdependence and context and relationship. So that's what I look at of like, not everyone has to be a practitioner. Not everyone should be a practitioner. I don't want a world full of spiritual practitioners because then nothing else would get done. And it becomes this weird, I also look at, we can say the same thing about spiritual practices that people talk about with like engineers, for example, where people who are engineers have a very specific type of brain that makes them really great at engineering. And if they keep just hanging out with other engineers, eventually that gets narrower and narrower and narrower because they're going really deeply in this one vein. So the things that they're developing, are they actually relevant to the rest of the context, to the 99 other percent of people who are not engineers? Right? Same with spiritual practitioners. If spiritual practitioners only come together and only hang out and talk with other spiritual practitioners, we keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into the realms of consciousness and lose sight of what is actually useful in the rest of the world. So I think it is very, very important of like, for people who are not practitioners, of draw from this well and learn your practices and cultivate your energy and learn how to regulate your field and learn your energetic responsibility so that you can regulate your psychic centers and have protection and stay grounded in your body and regulate your nervous system, etc., and go out in the world and be that and infuse everything else that you're doing with that. And then also a reminder for those of us who are practitioners to not lose touch with the rest of what it means to actually be a human in the world, and not go all, whitewashing, spiritual bypassing, light and love this shit. Like, don't forget why we're here. Because if we forget what we're here to serve and who we're here to help, we're just going to become completely useless as we're off like navel gazing into how great we are at being conscious people. And that is ultimately not why we're here. We're here to serve. We're here to participate. We're here to heal. We're here to uplift and inspire and educate and support everyone in this emergent consciousness.
Mm. It's so good. Oh, I could talk for 30 more minutes about what you just said, because that's actually how I accidentally fell into this work that I'm doing now, where I just saw people going and drinking ayahuasca over and over and over and over, and then not actually making any changes and not actually integrating it and not taking any actions in their life to bring the medicine back to, quote, reality here on planet Earth. And that's what a lot of people forget, especially, people whose patterning might be like, well, I'm just in the spiritual clouds. I'm in 5D. I don't even want to be associated on Earth. But, you're here embodied on Earth, whether you like it or not. And I do believe we're here for a reason. And it's like, well, what's the use of all of this if it's just a gigantic spiritual bypass, which, by the way, happens a lot in the medicine space, which is a whole other episode. And it's true. It's like, well, the whole point of any of this, the medicine, the healing work, it's like we have to remember we are here incarnated on Earth for that reason, to bring it back into the day to day. So yeah, it's not just about go take mushrooms every weekend or drink ayahuasca every other week and things will be okay. It's like, no, there's actual work to do and showing up. So I'm glad you mentioned it. That was great. Well, Michelle, let's hear about what you have going on in the next, 6 to 12 months this year. What's on the radar, and where can people find you and how can people work with you?
Thank you. Yeah. So the shamanic practice is asking for center stage. So I mentor and train people in shamanic practices, both as people who are emerging into their professional practice, but also for people who don't want it for the professional practice, but want it for themselves. So supporting people in animistic, ethical shamanism. I do this one-on-one. And then I also have a shamanic temple membership that I offer with my shaman sister, Catherine Bird, who is my co-host of the podcast, Shaman Sister Sessions. So we have that membership that has monthly classes and has community circles, and then also serving psilocybin. That information is on my website. I currently have a couple of ceremonies a year that I'm offering as group ceremony experiences, but that is also an option if someone wants to come sit with me one-on-one or put a ceremony together, then I can do something that's not currently on the calendar. So again, supporting people in shamanic practice for themselves and for their profession. And then, the podcast, Shaman Sister Sessions. My website is michellehawk.com. I think that's all going to be in the information. But yeah, please do reach out to me if this resonates with you and you feel called. I also have a bunch of other ways to engage with me for different free classes that I offer. And I'm just following the spirit, the flow of what spirit is asking me to put out. So I recently did a little class series on ethical shamanism, and we'll see if that continues or doesn't. Again, it's all in the organic flow.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been so great. It's so great to touch base with you and hear about what's going on and explore this a lot further. And yeah, we'll have all your links right here in the show notes. Thank you so much, Michelle, for doing the work that you do in the world, especially more than anything, and sharing your medicine.
Thank you, Beth. This was so great. Yeah, obviously we could talk for a very long time about this, but I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation, and thank you for doing what you do. It's a pleasure.